Thank you, Gunnar. Very happy to be here. So to plan and execute reaches, the brain essentially needs to convert sensory inputs about the hand and the target into appropriate motor commands for the arm, including using information about which arm to actually use for the reach. So previously, we have combined magnetoencephalography, or MEG, with a pro-anti-reaching task to address this. And so participants essentially had to point towards a target, either in pro trials, where they had to point towards the target, or in anti-trials, where they had to point to the mirror opposite of the target, and that depended on the color of the target, essentially. And we used the brain's lateralization with respect to the visual hemifield on the body to ask which brain areas show differential activation that correlates with the sensory motor transformation, so the transforming essentially the target location into the appropriate movement. And we essentially determined if areas are correlated with sensory or motor information through differences between conditions. If only sensory information was present, then we expect the same activation for leftward targets regardless of the movement, and the same activation for rightward targets regardless of the movement. In contrast, for movement information, the same activation is expected, for example, for a pro-leftward trial and an anti-rightward trial, because those would result in the same movement. So when you subtract pro from anti and left from right, then you would essentially get a signal that is driven by sensory information. And if you subtract pro-left, anti-right from anti-left, pro-right, you would get this, the same thing for movement. So using this reasoning, we showed that right after target presentation, there's a feed-forward sweep of sensory information from occipital to frontal areas. And then motor coding essentially, or correlation with movement, showed up first in the frontal areas. And then we found essentially that afterwards there was a backwards sweep of motor coding from the frontal areas towards the parietal areas. And on top of that, this motor plan was stored in working memory as evidenced by sustained parietal gamma band activation during the delay period, but I'm not showing this here. So now remember that to produce a movement, we also need to know what effector to use. So this data is only using the right hand. However, little is known about the cortical network underlying the integration of information about which arm to use, and that's exactly what we're going to address here. So to address this, we used the data from the same pro-anti task as I showed you before, but now we recorded from both hands in the block design. So again, either you had the left hand during a whole block of trials in a pro-anti trial, or the right hand. And again, this was a memorized reach with about 1.5 seconds between the onset of the cue, so the spatial cue, and the onset of the movement cue. And so we then looked at the difference in oscillatory power between the pre-target baseline and any time point after the target onset. And so this is what's shown here. And since we're interested in the integration of hand information with a movement plan, I will only show movement aligned results here. But we also did, of course, a sensory aligned analysis, but there was no significant effects there. So here's an example of the desynchronization that you would get essentially in the beta band power here, leading up to the movement. And so you can see that essentially prior to the movement onset, which is at 0 here, you get this desynchronization in left primary motor cortex when the right hand is used. And this is for a pro-leftward target. Now, if we look at the same thing for a rightward target, you see pretty much the same thing. And that is simply because we cannot, or MEG cannot resolve left versus right movements in this case. So we can essentially average across these two, for example. Now, you can do the same analysis for the data of the left hand. So if you do that, then you can see, so this is again in the left primary motor cortex. And since the left primary motor cortex mostly codes for right hand usage, you can see there's much less of a desynchronization here. Okay, so we will now perform essentially a subtraction analysis to compute a single summary result for hand use coding in a given bilateral brain area. And so then we can essentially average across different conditions here. So the way we do that is that we essentially have the same as on the previous slide. So we have the left M1 right hand use, the left M1 left hand use, and then we can subtract them to get the left minus right hand for the left M1. We can do the exact same thing now for the right M1, and you can see that there's the opposite result here from the left M1. That's simply because the subtractions is done in the same way. And then if we subtract essentially left M1 from the right M1, we get a single index essentially for bilateral primary motor cortex of what's going on. And we can then time resolve that a little bit differently here by just looking at the 20 hertz of beta band activation and asking essentially when that becomes significant. And you can see that very early on, prior to movement onset, there is evidence for hand information being coded in primary motor cortex. Okay, so next we want to essentially look at the whole brain map of where this happens. And this is shown 500 milliseconds prior to the movement. So here's what we see. We find essentially that hand use related beta band activity changes in frontal parietal areas. And we also find alpha band changes in more posterior areas. And note that alpha band is typically associated with sensory processing. Okay, so next we want to know how the hand information was integrated with the motor plan. So we computed essentially the motor information separately for left and right hand. And we argued that if there was a difference between both, then this is indicative of a hand-specific motor plan. What I'm showing here is the difference for left M1 between the left and the right motor plans. And so you can see that there is some differences again in the beta band showing up. And if you do the same thing for the right motor cortex, the opposite happens here, which is essentially to say that the same thing happens, but due to the calculation, the sign is inverted. And then we can again essentially compute by subtracting left and right M1 an overall index of the interaction between hand and movement effect. And that shows some significance before the movement onset. So looking at the whole brain map in the 500 milliseconds prior to the movement again, we find that we have hand-specific motor plans in a more sparse network than hand representation of the brain. And this is only the case in the beta band and not in the alpha band. Now, we can also look essentially at, or to summarize those results, we can highlight the areas that show movement information in pink. So this is from our previous study. And now overlay essentially the hand specificity in blue and whether motor plans were different for each hand in green. And so you can see that different subnetworks are involved to represent hand information and hand-specific motor plans. And then we also looked at the timing of these signals. That's the nice thing we can do with MEG. So here is essentially the detection of significant hand information and hand movement interactions. And you can see that different brain areas essentially show this at different points in time. And there's no order if you compare, for example, the hand coding and the hand motor interaction here. And then if you overlay that to our previous studies results with respect to when a motor plan became apparent, you get essentially a pattern like this. And from there, we can essentially summarize by saying that we found independent hand and motor plans in the parietal occipital junction and dorsal premotor cortex. We found hand use only, so no motor plan in the superior parietal lobe and primary somatosensory cortex. And we found a hand-specific motor plan in the superior parietal occipital cortex, the interparietal lobe, the ventral interparietal sulcus, and primary motor cortex. And so maybe I can also say that given that there was sort of like different aspects involved in motor planning, we found essentially different subnetworks that were involved in those different aspects of the sensory motor transformation and movement planning. And maybe the reason why we found so many brain areas typically activating when we ask participants to do a simple reaching task is that we don't probe all these different aspects, like which hand to use, posture, decision-making, rule coding, et cetera, et cetera. And so this would be our hypothesis to say, or our prediction to say, is that if you were to tease those apart, you would find different overlapping subnetworks that all contribute to reach planning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Gunnar. Thanks very much for the interesting talk. For those who are interested, I've also put the associated paper into the chat where you can look this up. Okay, then there is a question here, but Caroline, I suppose that is related to one of your previous interactions with the audience, or could you unmute yourself, Caroline?
Which one are you referring to? Which question?
The one that is just appearing in the chat.
Sorry, that was yeah, I was answering JJ.
Okay. Then there is no problem. Then there's a question here from Bernard Marius Hart. Is there an effect on practice on the activity patterns? Gunnar.
I have not looked at that. We see, so if you look at the experiment was a blocked design, and we used different postures. And if you look essentially at different postures, early versus late in a block, there's no difference. So I have split the data, like just like the first. There was always 400 trials in a block. So the first 200 versus the last 200, I essentially find the same effects. Although I must say that I might not have the statistical power to resolve any more subtle differences there.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that answers your question. Are there any more questions with respect to Gunnar's talk? We have still time for questions. Okay, then how could different arm postures, how could they maybe change the motor planning, Gunnar?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. It's actually something we have the data for, but I haven't analyzed that yet into too much detail. A little bit though. So we can. The idea is essentially that if you do these pointing movements like this, right? You can also do them like this. But if you now flip your arm around, then this movement here, which now goes to the left, essentially would go to the right in this posture, right? So essentially, there is a posture dependence on the spatial effects of your muscle activation, and that should be reflected somewhere in the sensory motor transformation for the movement planning. And we're still analyzing that, and hopefully maybe next year at Neuromatch Conference, I don't know what that will be, 6.0 or something like that, I will be able to give you the results.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Well, then if there are no further questions from the